All right, Friday night, one of my favorite nights because we get to talk triathlon, and this is the evidence-based triathlete. Hey, Ted, how's it going?
Good. Friday night, it's big race weekend in Las Vegas.
Oh, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Rock and roll marathon
Rock and
this
roll. Yep.
weekend.
Race
Uh,
weekend and volunteer weekend.
yep, both. It's going to be cold. I'm just so glad we're not having it tomorrow, right? Like the one day it's supposed to rain all day is tomorrow, and
A
so
5K is tomorrow, so
but I mean, still, I'd rather do a 5K in the rain than a half marathon or a 10K in the rain, especially if you're volunteering. Because some of those volunteers, like you, John, I know you're going to be out there for many hours.
yeah.
And it was miserable, obviously.
I'm going to be biking for the 5K, so
Was that what you're doing?
yeah, yeah.
You get your mud guards on your bike?
Oh yeah, I got my big yellow fisherman jacket ready to go.
Awesome.
Well, let's jump into this because we've got a guest tonight. We got Dr. Brian Schilling. Hey Brian, how's it going?
Going great. Glad to be here.
Good deal. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. You know, the wonderful thing about Las Vegas and our community is we have so many experts in our area. And at UNLV specifically, we've got some great expertise. And this is great to tap into the strength and conditioning expertise of UNLV and Dr. Brian Schilling. Is it okay if I call you Brian?
Please call me Brian.
Yeah. Brian has such a fabulous background in strength and conditioning, and I do claim we can call him a multi-sport athlete. They're
Yes.
just different sports. So, and he's taken me out, tried to teach me how to use a pistol and shoot. What did I shoot? What kind of rifle was it?
That was an AR-15.
Yeah.
AR-15. Yeah, so that was pretty exciting. So thank you for joining us, and maybe just to get us started, if you can sort of talk about your academic background that you have that's gotten you to UNLV.
Yeah, I mean, my academic background really follows my sport background. Grew up in nowhere, Wisconsin, where the only sport was football, at least as far as I was concerned. And I was always undersized. So the idea was I was going to get into strength training so that I wasn't going to get creamed playing football. And I was good enough to get to practice football at a Division II school in college and get paid for it. Didn't play a whole lot, but I practiced. But it was really all that I was always into the idea of training. And that's where I pursued academics. And I was fortunate enough to be able to intern with the Olympic Training Centers a couple times. And then I ended up at Appalachian with getting my master's degree, working with Mike Stone, who was probably the preeminent expert in strength training. Got into Olympic lifting after my football career was firmly over. But it was when I was working with the Olympic Committee as I actually worked with my first triathletes when I was working in Colorado Springs. But I came to this point where I was like, well, am I going to be a strength coach or am I going to go and do the research? And I applied to be the head strength coach at the Lake Placid Training Center. I didn't get the job, and that was God's way of telling me to go into academics.
No.
And so I did. And so I've been doing it ever since, and it's worked out great. Parallel to that, all the men and women I came up with in the strength coaching world, when I went into academics, they kind of started to go into this new line of military strength and conditioning. And so I ended up with graduate students that were into that, and that kind of went back in that general direction. So now all of my research work is really in military and first responder human performance. But I'm still a strength training guy at heart.
Oh, that's great. And so, yeah, so, and I should have mentioned that Brian sends Ted and I articles related to strength and conditioning and multi-sport, and we've actually used a number of those articles. So thank you for
Oh,
parsing the
good.
literature and finding those resources. So,
Excellent.
at what point did you sort of pursue your PhD and really zeroing in on strength and conditioning? Was there a specific arm, well, the military and first responder, but where do you see your sort of niche in strength and conditioning?
Yeah, it was really hard for me to find a PhD program that really was doing what I wanted to do. So I ended up getting a PhD in biology, which is it's a really long story on paper. But the moral of the story is I got to work with Andy Fry at the University of Memphis, and he was a great mentor. And he was a mentee of Bill Kramer, who's kind of probably the other big strength training guy out there besides Michael Stone. So I kind of had this perfect world where I got great mentorship from people who are really interested in strength conditioning. So my dissertation was really looking at muscle fiber adaptations to training, or actually whole muscle adaptations, but we looked at biopsy information to see how the muscle was changing. But I tried to leave Memphis and I couldn't get out. I got a really great job offer to stay there. And so based on what I had been doing and what Andy was still doing there, I kind of went in the neuromuscular direction, which kind of rounded out our lab facility, what we could do as collaborators. But then it took me down a strange road. I ended up doing some work in Parkinson's disease, looking at the neuromuscular adaptations to strength training in people with Parkinson's disease. And that's kind of where I was really honed in before I started going into the tactical world. So I've kind of been across the map, a lot of different sports. At one point, if I was going to stay in strength and conditioning, I was going to get out of football. I had my fill of football as a player and coach, and I really wanted to go into Olympic sports. So I got it. That was the benefit of being with the Olympic training centers, that I got exposed to sports I'd never, not fathomed. I mean, I was working with canoe and kayak and archery and all these sports in Chula Vista. And then I went to Colorado Springs. I got to work with, Greco-Roman wrestling and freestyle wrestling and triathlon. And we had triathlon camps that were coming through there. And so they were like, they didn't know anything either. And I didn't know anything either. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to take what I don't know and what you don't know and see if we can't add it together and see if we can't come up with stuff. And what we really worked with then in triathlon was really speed work. And sprinting speed and, at the, close of races, how do you close the gap or, passing? We found out that their sprinting technique was terrible. But also that they just didn't, like you said, the training demand for triathlon is so great. It's kind of hard to figure out where the strength and conditioning and the injury prevention work fits into that giant time suck that training really is.
Okay, so you already started to go down the road, which is great. So that being said, because it is, triathlon itself is a time suck, right? We're talking about maybe 15 hours a week for an age grouper, and maybe before big races up to 20 hours a week. What is the minimum effective dosage of strength training, in your opinion, that a triathlete would have to do or could do to, see some benefits?
That's a great question. I mean, we tend to think of like in terms of weeks and months and days and stuff like that because of our the way our clocks work. And so there's been some interesting strength training work looking at like, what if you just did once a week? Is that really enough? Or is it necessarily the frequency per week, or is it the dose per session? And what that really starts to go down to is this rabbit hole of the number of acute training variables that they are. Like, and this is not specific to triathlon. Everybody wants to say, what is the training program? Like, give me a training program. Like, well, that it doesn't exist. And if it does exist, we don't know it because we can't study that. There's too many acute training variables for me to say this is the training program for X, Y, and it could be like something simple like I just want to add muscle or I want to gain strength. Now we're talking about I want to do strength and conditioning that's going to make me a better triathlete. Right. Not just I want to get bigger and stronger. That's the simple stuff. We really add complexity to it. To how does the strength and conditioning augment a sport? Some sports it's a little bit more simple. Like in football, size matters in a lot of cases and speed matters. But there's a little bit more nuance when we get into applying strength training principles to endurance sports. It's probably about once a week, but it can't be constant. Just like your triathlon training can't be constant. That really gets into the idea of you have to have an idea of what your training calendar looks like. And you have to understand that in this phase, I'm going to put a little bit more emphasis on the strength and conditioning. Whereas, like you said, when a race is coming up, I'm going to put more work into my triathlon specific training.
Yeah, I think that, the word we use in coaching, and I'm sure you used it a lot too, is like the periodization, right?
Absolutely.
And so periodizing strength training, in my opinion, should be part of the plan. Is in particular in the off season when triathlon for most age groupers has a pretty big off season because it's just too dang cold to go swimming in the lake. And so most triathletes it's like November to April, so you got like 5 months there. And in my experiences, it's that those 5 months you can actually do a lot of good work in strength training, whereas in the middle of summer when it's maybe you have three races in 5 or 6 weeks, you probably don't have the opportunity to do it, or you wouldn't want to do it because you don't want to get sore and you don't want to add extra fatigue to the system. Does that sound about right?
It absolutely is. I mean, the whole idea of periodization goes back to ancient Greece, and it has to do with periods of the sun. Like make hay when the sun shines, right? When days are longer, you have more time to do certain things. And when days are shorter, you have less time to do certain things. So yeah, you hit it on the head. You need to have some idea of at least, I mean, you don't have to have every set and rep and mile and heart rate zone scheduled for 365 days, but you got to have some idea of, you know, where the ebb and flow is and where I'm going to focus on this versus, you know, some of the other things I may want to work on.
Yeah. No, I think that's so good. And then I also like the fact that you were saying that, you know, it has to be individual, right? Like these things have to be individual. And the thing that I've always kind of looked at is looking for areas of weakness, not areas of strength. Right.
Without a doubt. I mean, that's one of the things, especially in the world of that I'm in now with the military and first responders, is you see it that everybody wants to train their strengths.
Yeah.
And it's you know, sometimes it's to demonstrate competency and to you know, maintain motivation. You know, I want to be successful in my training, but the ones who really make the biggest gains are the ones who are able to recognize where their weaknesses are and are willing to train them.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like right now, it's still the off season for me, and I, you know, I kind of made this deal with myself that this off season, my goal was to get my hamstrings as strong as possible because I've had hamstring issues, and I've dedicated this winter to hamstrings, and it's not great. I got to be honest with you. They were very weak in November and December, and they're slowly getting stronger. But I've got to be careful too. You know, I also have noticed that if I'm working them too hard and then I go and try and run a little fast, you know, there's a chance I'm actually going to injure myself. So I have to be careful with what I'm doing as well. So how does someone balance that? Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There's so many acute training variables. You have to figure out, you know, which are the ones that are going to cause the most demand, right? So is it frequency per week or frequency per session? So maybe your best training program is that you can set aside that time for once a week or twice a week. And so you have to squeeze as much as you can in that time, or you're in a situation where it's more like I have more time, like on a daily basis, I have my home gym or whatever, I can go squeeze X, Y, and Z in there. So you kind of have to figure out how you squeeze that in to that general training program. It's tough. There really are no simple answers. For the most part, though, I think where people really start to hamper themselves is to get into this idea that specificity is simulation. So if I'm training specifics for my sport, so therefore what I'm doing in the weight room has to look like what I do in a triathlon.
Right.
It's a bad example because nobody really thinks that for a triathlon, but for a lot of other sports they do. I'm, you know, stick and ball sports, I've seen it a lot of times, like, well, I need to use a weighted bat because that's going to help me swing my bat better. It's like, actually, no, it's probably going to make your swing suck. So you might not want to do that, but you can still train that. The benefit, though, of understanding that is that when you are competing on your feet, you have gravity, right? So when we're talking about triathlon, outside of what you're doing in the water, gravity is always the enemy, right? So I mean, John can tell you about running speed, right? It's about you put your foot down, you pick your foot and put it back down again. It doesn't matter if you're sprinting or jogging; it's still the same limiting factor of putting your foot down and picking it back up again. The foot contact times in endurance sports aren't that much longer than they are in sprinting, relative. So you can train the anti-gravity muscles and find that benefits triathlon training without it looking like I'm doing, you know, 50 rep step ups, because I think that mimics triathlon better than doing low rep squats or low rep step ups or lower rep lunges.
So I love this, and I've got a couple of different angles I want to go here, but I'm going to start with this. A lot of our triathletes pick up the sport as an adult, and they may not have a sport background at all. So as you're talking about this, and you're even stating there's a lot of information out there, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different programs. How does someone even start trying to figure out how to incorporate strength training within their training program?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting that you mentioned that, like the adult athlete and the starting later on in life and not having that athletic background, because in a lot of cases, you're finding like it's almost like literacy, like movement literacy. Like, can you do these movements? So for where I think what people would start would be simple mobility exercises. mean, if you're sitting down a lot in general, like in your job, right? And then you're sitting on the bike a lot, and then you're doing relatively limited ranges of motion in running, it might be mobility is where you start. There's actually a pretty good allegory in some of the military groups I work with that you'd be surprised at very high performing people who are not athletes. And so a lot of it's really just mobility, right? It's injury prevention work, which is not sexy in a lot of cases, because it's not like, this is not going to make my triathlon better tomorrow. And it's hard to demonstrate sometimes, because like, well, I didn't get hurt. Does it mean because I did the injury prevention stuff? Or, you know, I got hurt one year because of bad luck, and therefore, you know, my injury prevention work didn't do anything for me in the off season. So I think a lot of that would be, it might be very simple multi-joint exercises and range of motion. Make sure that you're mobile, that the mobility that you need to be, that's going to decrease over time, and that may be limited through the sport of triathlon.
I love that, because it doesn't need to be a sophisticated program, especially in the beginning. You don't need a lot of equipment. You don't need, necessarily access to a big gym. I love that, talking about starting with mobility exercises.
I mean, it may be that I'm just an old timer, but I still believe in the simplest methods. I think that, you know, when marketing creeps in and people are trying to sell the new and sexy thing, there's, you need to do this new thing and do that thing. It's like, people have been lifting heavy things for a long period of time, and it's shown to be pretty effective. So, you don't have to have a super sophisticated program, not to start, and maybe not at all, in order to make it applicable to your sport.
So I love that. And just to follow back to what you were saying before, the specificity piece sort of goes right along with this. With triathlon, I mean, we're swimming, it's upper body, we're running and biking, it's lower body. How do I incorporate strength training to address the specifics of the movement, but not necessarily having to mimic the movements? Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. I mean, I'm a sinker. I don't not much swimming, but the ranges of motion that are required for efficient swimming are pretty large at the shoulder. So when I'm thinking about upper body strength training for triathlon, I'm immediately thinking like, let's stabilize the shoulder the best we can, because a shoulder injury will hurt badly, right? I mean, you can kind of fake your way through a lot of other injuries, but your swim is going to suck if your shoulders are injured. So, I mean, that would be my immediate focus, would be around strengthening the rotator cuff and strengthening the musculature around the shoulder. The large range of motion, leads to a high injury potential. For the lower body, I might not even go that much further away and say that it's still going to be range of motion limited. But like Ted was saying, like working your hamstrings for a certain period of time, because it's a less active during certain phases of the bike or the run, that might be most important. But then again, it also goes back to your weaknesses. We don't typically think about training your weaknesses when we think about injury prevention, because we don't know about it until it happens. And then after the fact, it's probably too late. So you kind of want to make sure that you're a little bit more robust in your training to round out the muscle groups to prevent injury. Then you might go back into the specific performance aspects of how you would train those muscle groups to increase your triathlon performance.
Yeah. So I love the fact that you're talking about injury prevention, because I think for a lot of triathletes, that's why they do the strength and conditioning. That's why I do strength and conditioning. I don't really do strength and conditioning because I think it's going to make me a better triathlete. It's going to make me a better triathlete because I'm hopefully not going to get injured as often, and then I can train, swim, bike, and run more. And I love the fact that you brought up the shoulder. You mentioned two things. You mentioned flexibility and stability, right? And so our shoulder and our hip are very similar in those contexts, right? So in the upper body, you mentioned like rotator cuff strengthening, which is super important for maintaining stability, but you have to have mobility as well. And it's the same in the hip. So you mentioned people sitting all day and sitting on a bike, and we mentioned even like the running, the movement of running, the movement of cycling has very little hip movement. Right? We're looking at 20 to 30 degrees of flexion and 10, 15 degrees of extension, probably on both biking and running. So, I think it's interesting. We do need to gain that mobility, but then we have to complement it with stability of the hip. And, we've talked about this, John and I've talked about this in the podcast a lot about, when you're running, to be most efficient, you need to have stable hips. So in that context, can you think of like some, maybe some really basic exercises we could talk about that would provide maybe mobility and stability, or is that a possibility?
I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think you have to really go beyond the hip and go into the lower torso as well, right? Because
Yeah,
it's you can't be stable with, all you have is that spinal column
yeah,
connecting your upper and lower body, and so your hips can be moving around the lower spine. I don't like the word core because it gets kind of confused about what people talk about. So I just like to say the lower torso or the upper torso musculature. I think it's a little bit more clear. But yeah, I think I think what's going on with your glute muscles is extremely important. Unfortunately, it's gotten like this bad rap of like, oh, you just want to have the big booty for bikini season, but it makes a lot of sense that you need to have have the requisite musculature doing what you want it to do at certain times. And if you're not activating those muscles, you need to find a way to do it. And the way we sit and stand, we just don't get a lot of activation of the glutes. I found being from the Olympic lifting background that we were always squat and pull, but now as I get older, I'm finding there's a lot of benefits to lunging exercises, and that can really open up your hips and give you range of motion and stability. And in certain circumstances, it can help with balance and coordination as well.
yeah. I love the fact you mentioned like the lower torso, because that's actually one of the areas that I think like a triathlete could almost do year round, right? Because it's not like you're going to be, you go for a 100-mile bike ride, your torso is not going to be super fatigued, right? Or you can ride if your torso is a little bit sore, or you could run with it sore, you can swim with it sore, because it's not like the prime mover of the activity you're doing. So I'm a big fan of doing, regular core work, or no, sorry, we didn't want to say the word core, but it's like
Okay.
lower torso work throughout the year.
Yeah, I mean, it probably depends on how your bike is set up too and what your lower back angles are at. I mean, I don't ride that much, and when I do ride, I do get sore in my lower back because I don't ride very much, right? And I'm not riding a tri bike either, and so so that probably has a lot to do with it. I'm sure John probably knows of studies. Maybe they've done long-term EMG over those 100-mile rides and see what happens to those muscles as they do fatigue from stabilizing yourself, or how much support you're gaining from your upper body on your bars versus holding yourself up via your lower torso.
Oh, I love that. And actually, I don't know of a study that's done that. And I'm sitting here thinking, oh, that would be a good study for us to take on. Is looking
All
at.
right, you can put me in the acknowledgments for that one then.
Yeah, there you go. So let's talk a little bit about recovery and strength training. I don't want to jump around too much, but this is another area that we talk a lot about. If you train, you have to recover, and then you train again. But how do you add in strength training relative to your endurance training and incorporate that recovery too? Like, uh, any thoughts on that part?
Yeah, I mean, it really just goes into you got to be smart about your total volume. And realize all stresses are cumulative. It doesn't matter if the stress is coming from your strength training or your tri training or your job that you hate or whatever it is, right? Those stressors are cumulative. So you have to keep that in mind. I mean, I think we are at an interesting time in the training world because recovery is come to the forefront, rightfully so. And there's a lot of supporting technologies to it. The flip side of the coin, though, is you have to train first.
Yeah.
And people spend a whole lot of time recovering and they're not actually working very hard. And so it's like, oh, that recovery piece really isn't working for me. It's like the recovery piece is working just fine. You're not working. That's the problem. And so I think that people want to get into the sexy recovery methods, and I think there's definitely benefits out there and there's new technologies, but you got to put in the work first. You have to give yourself something to recover from.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's right. And okay, so now let me ask a more specific question then. If I got a swim workout on Tuesday, do I do my strength for my upper body on Monday or Wednesday?
If your swim is Tuesday, I do it after. I mean, I think you need to, you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're increasing your injury risk during your swim, but also just you don't want to let your soreness or just neuromuscular fatigue mess with your stroke, because you need that stroke. You need to have it well. So I would definitely err on the side of doing it after. But it may depend on the time of the training year. It may just depend on what that swim looks like relative to all your other swim workouts versus when your next race is, and those other things as well.
I love it. Yeah, that's great. That's one of our listener questions. So,
Well, then how about, if we're gonna do it in the same day as something else? Like, cause I can't remember where I read it. It was something like saying you want to kind of separate out your aerobic and your strength training by a certain amount of time. I think they said 6 hours was a thing.
Yeah, I
Is
mean,
it a true
that
thing, or?
it is, and there's some decent research. I've done some of that looking at this idea of concurrent training. And it's obviously because of the field that I'm in now, it makes a whole lot of sense because you kind of have to be a jack of all trades. So you might have to train a bunch of different things and a bunch of different qualities. Here's what people don't want to hear. So this is the thing that people don't want to hear is there are people that are going to be high performers no matter how they train. There's actually some really interesting research out there looking at, like, if you look at the decathlon, right? So a decent allegory, almost all the events in the decathlon are strength power events, except for the mile, right? So by physiological standards, the guy who does the best at all the other events, the other 9 events, is going to suck at the mile. Guess what? Doesn't happen. The guy who wins the other 9 events probably wins the mile too. Why? Because he can do that because he's a stud, and that's individual quality. So that has a lot to do with it. So that's one component of it. On the other hand, it's like those ideas like, well, it's got to be 6 hours or is it 5 hours? There are so many acute training variables in the endurance workout and in the strength workout. Adding one more variable to try to figure out the time between sessions is kind of getting to the point where it's just, you're not going to answer that question. How much time do you need to work out? Well, it depends on what you did for the endurance workout or what you're going to do for the strength workout or vice versa. And there's an infinite number of variables for those things. It's going to be hard to tell. Now, if you look at systemic fatigue, then you should maximize the time between workouts, because that way, whatever fatigue is there that is systemic, not particular to that workout, is give you time to recover. But you also need to sleep. So you need to figure out, how many hours do I have in the day in order for me to get those workouts in and get the sleep in. I mean, I know when I was training with the weightlifting team in Colorado Springs, it was normal for them to work out twice on Monday, once on Tuesday, twice on Wednesday, off on Thursday, twice on Friday, once on Saturday. So you 2 off days a week, but you're doing multiple workouts on several days a week. And that was a minimal training schedule. So it was this idea that, you have fitness and fatigue going on simultaneously. And when you begin that training workout session, you start to fatigue. And so if you can stop before that fatigue manifests itself in a big manner, you can recover. When you start that second workout, you can actually do not twice the volume, but you can prove probably 1.5 the amount of volume that you do if you did it in a single session.
Awesome. So I want to add one other piece to this, because I think you answered it really well, but I'm going to throw this out to all our triathletes out there. Your day off, if you have a day off, should not be your strength training day.
Without a doubt. You hit it on the head.
And a lot of people do that. They're like, oh, okay, well, I don't have my swim, bike, or run on a Friday, so that's my day to lift weights, because then you literally never recover.
Absolutely. I mean, your recovery day should be some mobility work and using those recovery modalities, whatever you like. So because a lot of it is psychosomatic. It's like what you like. If you like ice baths will work for you. And if you like saunas will probably work for you too. So I agree with you. You can't treat it as the recovery day. That needs to be part of your training program, depending on where you are in your race cycle and your season. And then you need to use those recovery days or recovery sessions, periods, as true recovery periods.
Yeah. I love it. All right. Well, how does age work into this? The older athlete versus the younger? I know when we were all in our 20s, we could probably do certain things, but as we get older, it gets a little bit tougher to get the training stimulus as well as recover from it.
Yeah, father time is undefeated. And so that's always the tough thing. And it's not just age, it's the mileage, right? I tell everybody, it's like, when you've done the mileage or you've done the sports that have those seasons that knock you down, that wears on you as well. So but I think there's some wisdom that comes along with that as well as you age, and so you tend to know your body a little bit better, and you can kind of maybe tell when it's time for me to back off or when it's time for me to push it forward. I don't know a lot about developmental type stuff, but the Canadian model that I've heard of before is fascinating to me. Like, and it's gone in youth sports now, is that there's no training to train anymore.
Mm.
It's you go straight from, you don't train to train, you start training and then you're competing constantly.
Mhm.
You have club volleyball, and then you have your club season, and then you have, you know, your club soccer, and then you have your regular high school season or whatever, and they're doing is competing, and they're never training anymore. And so I think that's why you see careers are shorter. They start earlier, but they end up being shorter because they're not looking at it in the long-term developmental model. And then the developmental model is like, it's really sexy from, you know, the prenatal to when you turn 25, and then nothing happens for, you know, 20 years. And then it's precipitous drop off on the other end. And then you got to figure out what you're going to do at that precipitous drop off, which the three of us are at right now.
Yeah.
So but I think there's going to be a part of that where you're going to have to decide, am I competing because I like competing, and am I willing to back off my competition schedule to train to compete, because I know that my aging body probably can't put up with those volumes that I was doing 10, 15 years ago.
You just made me cry.
I'm sorry. I hate to be the bearer of bad news.
No. It's, you know, the thing is, it's looking us all in the face, right? Like, we are not who we were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and we have to respect that.
Yeah.
And you know, the other thing I wanted to, you know, touch on, Brian, and I know you're well versed in this area as well, is that as we age, the importance of maintaining muscle mass.
Mhm.
And so you want to just speak to that, because I think a lot of people get into triathlon as something for their long-term health, right? And it's really good for the long-term cardiovascular health, but I think that muscle mass long-term is also super important. So do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. It's not just aging, but sex comes into it as well, right? So women are going to be probably be at a disadvantage for upper body strength. But then as we age, if you're going to lose type 2 fibers at a higher rate than your type 1 fibers, then that disadvantage in upper body strength is going to become greater for women at age. So I'm big on, especially on upper body training for women, especially as they approach the age, the increasing age. And then for men, it's not exactly that much different in that, yeah, you want to maintain that muscle mass, but it's not just how you train, it's how you eat and how you do everything else, right? So you know, for men, our when we hit viropause, or when our testosterone starts to go down, that's when we start to lose more muscle mass. And a lot of that has to do with nutrition. You know, I'm married to a sports dietitian, so I feel like I could talk about those things a little bit. Is that you know, testosterone production and vitamin D are pretty closely linked. In the triathlon world, that's actually a blessing, because we're outside, right? You're outside on the bike, hopefully, at least you're maximizing that. I mean, I can't imagine putting as much time on the bike as you guys do, but I sure couldn't do it if it was all inside, right? I'd have to be outside, and that's one of the benefits of the sport, right? If you're into it. So the benefit of the sun exposure is going to help for vitamin D for sure. And then you got to fuel your body. That's a big thing in our household is under fueling. And with my wife Leslie, her work with triathletes, but also with performing arts, stuff like that, is that people are under fueling, and it's a problem. And it's because of this idea of the latest fad diets. People are jumping onto this fad and that fad, and it's like, man, you got to put fuel in the furnace. If you want to put those miles in, you got to fuel them. You want to put those reps in, you got to fuel it. And so yeah, maintaining muscle mass is important. You need to strength train, and you need to consider your diet and your other lifestyle factors that go into that as well.
I'm glad you mentioned the underfueling, because one of the things we did right before we got on, I had a little bowl of Reese's Pieces over by my bike trainer, and I wanted to get them off camera. But you know, I actually think that that's a really good thing for me to do, because like you're saying with underfueling, I was trying to do strength training and do a 90-minute ride, right? And so if you think about that, how many calories did I burn? Could I, you know, and in your opinion, if I was underfueling today, is my strength training as effective?
It's probably not. No, it's probably not as effective. It depends, right? It depends on your training age as well. Like if you've got a lot of neuromuscular adaptations that have already been there, and you're really training for hypertrophy or trying to maintain muscle mass, it's going to be more effective if you're training for hypertrophy or muscle mass, and if you haven't already had those neuromuscular gains that you would have early on or early in your training career. the other thing that goes along with age is that so we talk about training age and chronological age, and I think people have a pretty good concept of that. But I also talk about the term tactical age. I don't know if that's the best term, but for the people that I work with, it's like their time in profession makes them, they have skills that other people can't have. They might be, if you look at firefighters, they tend to be more efficient at using their air tanks than younger firefighters. And that's just, it comes with time. It comes with expertise and or skill or time in the job. And I think that goes to, same with your time in the bike seat, right? You have that advantage of, you might be slightly more efficient. Maybe you don't have to put in as many miles on the bike or miles on the road, because you've got those patterns ingrained and you've got the tactical knowledge that you can exploit in the race. And therefore, maybe you can spend a little more of that time with the strength training and working on those other aspects of it.
No, I think that's so interesting. John and I've talked quite a bit about this, about, once you've gotten a lot of racing under your belt and a lot of training under your belt, you can get away with a lot more. Mm-hmm. And maybe the thing that we can get away with is actually spending more time strength training. I think that's a really good message.
It's really hard. Like I said, with all the acute training variables and with the passage of time, it's hard to say, it's hard to connect the dots for transfer training effect for these very complex sports like triathlon, and adding in, strength training and mobility work.
Well, and to that point, I mean, a lot of triathletes will hear, okay, I need to add in strength training. So I'm going to continue with my regular swim, bike, and run workouts. And then I'm going to add in 2 or 3 additional workouts. And so at some point, and you're speaking to this in terms of load, at some point it's going to be too much. I mean, what types of things do you start watching for, either in the endurance world or in the strength world, that are indicators of overtraining or maybe pending injury?
That's a great point. I mean, heart rate variability is the new and hot thing, and it's a good measure, and it's relatively easy to get. I mean, a chest strap and a watch, you're set. However, resting heart rate is still a pretty good measure, and it's free. You don't even need a watch. You need a finger and a stopwatch, right? So I mean, definitely track your resting heart rate, and it will, the idea of sympathetic versus parasympathetic overtraining, there's still going to be some overlap. And it could be that maybe a more sensitive measure like heart rate variability will pick that up. We did some pretty complex stuff when I was at Memphis. We were looking at nocturnal catecholamines. Well, I mean, nobody's going to, pee in the bottle every morning and get up and run their catecholamines. We did some pretty crazy protocols where they were doing 10 1 repetition maximums every day for a week. And so we were deliberately trying to induce overtraining and seeing what those variables look like. But your resting heart rate is usually a pretty good one, because and Graham can probably speak to this a little bit more than I can, because it's still going to be reflected in your sleep, because those stressors are cumulative. And if you're not sleeping, your resting heart rate is going to be going up anyway.
The one that I really like is when you're on the bike, if you can't get your heart rate up. So you're out doing your aerobic work, and let's say you're a half hour in, you're like, okay, I'm going to bump up to 200 watts or whatever, and your heart rate doesn't climb. That's a really good sign, at least for me, that I'm kind of at that point where, actually, I probably should just turn around and go home and rest today. And I think that for too long in the endurance world, we've looked at that. Oh, look how efficient I am. My heart rate's not going up. When that's not what we're actually looking at. That's not the metric we want to actually look for. So I think that's a really another one that you can look for on the bike, because in other worlds we look at performance metrics, right? So if you're a weightlifter and all of a sudden you can't lift the weight you're normally lifting, that's a good sign. It's sometimes harder in triathlon because we don't, let's say, compete very often to look at a true performance metric, but something like that. And you can always look at the data where you look at heart rate versus power and track that for, and you want to track it for a long period of time, because one bad sleep can do that to you as well. But if it's a pattern you're starting to create, I think that's something we can ultimately look for.
Yeah, I mean, having those benchmarks that you go back to are important. And it may be early on, you take the shotgun approach, you're testing a bunch of stuff and relating it back to performance. And you say, for me, or for my training methods, this is the benchmark that I need to be keeping track of. I just happen to know that. I mean, I like having the smartwatch, but I know my sleep pretty much dictates everything. It's my sleep is the thermostat and the thermometer for my life. how my cognitive abilities during the day and my training, it all goes back to my sleep, but it also affects my sleep. If I'm training hard, I can sleep more as long as I'm not training too much. And when the volume gets high, then it affects my sleep again. So that thermostat thermometer balance really comes back into it for me.
Yeah. So we've talked about on the show before. One of mine also is so I have a 2-story house, I sleep upstairs. If I've got to take 2 steps on every step to go in the morning, then I'm not well recovered. If I can go down with 1 step, then I'm like, I'm okay. I'm doing okay. But it's funny. It's like something really little like that. And it's not, I'm not consciously planning it. It's like how I naturally would go down the stairs. And once again, it's just a good metric for me, and it might not be the right metric for everyone, but that's one of the ones for me.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell by my appetite sometimes. It better when I was younger, but I knew when my appetite was up, make hay when the sun shines. Time to push the training envelope, because my metabolism is saying it's time to go.
Yeah, and we can't ignore that signal, right? Because I think a lot of times our triathletes are like, oh my gosh, I'm always hungry. Good, then eat and train hard.
No doubt. I mean, you got to be intuitive with your hunger fullness cues, and just your status in general. Like I think that's one of the benefits that comes with longer term training. Like I know now is the time for me to push, right? I can just kind of feel like maybe time's for me to back off a little bit. But that a lot of that comes with time, and I think we're getting past that where it's like a badge of courage. Like, oh, well, you did 100 miles. Well, I did 120. So there, it's like, yeah, but my 100 miles made me better. Your 120 made you worse. So it's not just about more is better.
I love it. Okay, so now you're getting into an area that triathletes are notorious for tracking their stress using, a training stress score or something like that. It's just math. But how do you incorporate that load? How do you build it into your overall training load for the week? How does someone monitor that? What are the metrics?
It's that is so complex, because we can look at tonnage, right? If you're a weightlifter and all you do is a snatch and clean and jerk, they literally just look at tonnage. Like, I lifted X tons this month, and next month it's going to be X number of tons or whatever. And for the endurance sports, we typically just look at mileage. Well, then how do you merge the worlds? How do you combine that all together? And I don't know what the good answer is, because we're talking about how do you compare things that are on different scales. And I think you have to go back to those indirect physiological measures, maybe like heart rate variability. We can't really do testosterone to cortisol ratio very simply. It's not quite that easy. Right. But you could look at come back to maybe some blood markers. If people have money and time that they want to invest in, like inside tracker, things like that, you can look at those markers. That's just really not feasible for a lot of people. For a lot of people, they're going to have to figure out, like, where is the simple stuff? Can I start with heart rate variability or just my resting heart rate, and then see where it goes from there? I know, the Garmin watch tells you it measures everything, but it does not measure everything to the same ability, right? And so, I think there's a lot of value in sleep scores. I'm not sure that the Garmin watch is the best sleep score out there. But it's not the worst. And I know a lot of really smart people are like, look, if you're really worried about your sleep, how much time are you spending in bed? Right? Like, if you're not in bed 8 hours, you can't sleep for 8 hours. So if you're complaining that you're only sleeping for 6 hours, but you're only in bed for 6 hours, well, then the problem is you're just not in bed. You need to get in bed and you need sleep. So I think there are some simpler measures that you can look at that you maybe can track that total physiological stress, but it doesn't have to be in the Garmin algorithm, I don't think.
Yeah. So I know everyone that's listening probably wants the magic bullet here. So I'm going to ask you the magic bullet question. If you could give us 3 maybe lower body exercises, because most people seem to be concerned with that. 3 lower body exercises that a triathlete could just put in their repertoire, just something to start with. If they haven't been weight training, something that they could start with.
I would go with a lunging exercise. I think if you can load it sufficiently, which I would give for the triathlete who's getting into it, I think you can probably load it sufficiently with some dumbbells before your grip gives out. I think a lunging gives you some strength, gives you some range of motion. If you're doing it barefoot, you can actually incorporate some balance and some joint stability into it as well. So I would start with that for a lower body as well. I think, like you had mentioned before, the posterior chain is a good place to start. What's going on with the glutes and the hamstrings? The hamstrings are pretty complex. People tend to think of them not quite so, but you've got, some that cross the hip and some that only cross the knee. But then the part that crosses the knee also interacts with the gastrocnemius. So it's a pretty complex thing that goes on in the back of the leg. So I think, if you can use like the Nordic leg curls, I happen to have just a regular roller where I could just do supine leg curls. I can interlace them with a band so I can get some added resistance. I think that's a good place to start. And I think some good ankle range of motion and ankle work are positive too, depending on what your mileage looks like, how fast you're wearing out shoes, what your pronation looks like. Those are more things that are in John's world. But I think you can work the lunge and the posterior chain, and then probably some specific ankle work would be a good place to start.
So I'm going to put a plug in for people for the foot and ankle, and this is something I give to a lot of the athletes that have had issues. And I'm a big fan of toe yoga. So you can go on YouTube and you can find 100 different toe yoga, and it's all foot and ankle stuff. And one of the reasons I'm a big fan of it is, especially with triathletes, we get locked in our shoes, especially the cycling shoes, and it's almost a cast, right? And so think about if you cast yourself, you're not getting very good mobility. And then we put in our shoes, and maybe we got an orthotic or something in our running shoes, and then we're at work and we're wearing shoes, and our muscles in our feet don't really develop very well, or are underdeveloped. So yeah, big fan of toe yoga, 10-15 minutes a couple times a week. Yeah, I got to get back on that, so I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I had a lot of ankle injuries when I was practicing college football, which is why I didn't play a whole lot, because I was injured a lot. So I've found that I've got to go with a zero drop shoe just for day-to-day type stuff, so I can maintain my Achilles range of motion. But yeah, I'm a big believer in that too. The idea that you wear bad shoes a lot, or you wore shoes too early when you were a kid and you didn't develop those muscles, and don't spend a lot of time barefoot. So I try to spend as much time out of my shoes as possible.
I love that advice. That's wonderful. All right, now I want to circle back to the nutrition part that you were talking about in terms of fueling for the workout. Maybe talk a little bit about, well, am I fueling with carbohydrate going into a workout? The questions that I often see is, how soon after the workout should I be eating? Is it protein at that point? And I know you've done some work in creatine too.
Yeah, I mean, the nutrition periodization stuff is fascinating to me, just because it makes a lot of sense based on your training volume and your training emphasis, that you would want to supply certain nutrients at certain times, right?
Mhm.
So obviously, when you're in that higher training volume period, you're going to want to make sure that you're fueling it with those carbohydrates. Whereas in your off season, maybe when you are concentrating on your strength training, your overall carbohydrate intake might not be quite as high, and you might increase your protein intake to make up for it. So the first thing is you got to fuel, period. You got to, if you don't have enough calories, it doesn't matter what your macronutrient ratios are, you're not fueling. They're not there. The calories aren't there to provide your training. But there's some good stuff on nutrient timing about making sure that you're taking advantage of your post-workout window to get your carbohydrates in, but also if your emphasis is on maintaining muscle, like Ted said before, or gaining muscle, that you're getting sufficient protein during that period. But the other thing is you got to get the calories, and sometimes that means you're going to have to eat fat. If you're a fat phobe, you're probably not going to perform very well, because it's dense. You need to get the density of the calories, and you need to get them in there. And so, we joke about adolescent or kids nutrition. You got to feed the baby is first thing. You like that. Feed the athlete is the first thing. You got to get the calories first. You can worry about the nuance later, but you got to get the calories first.
I love that. That's great advice. All right, I gotta get caught up on a couple of questions here online. So, what is meant by posterior chain? Maybe Ted, do you want to
Oh
actually?
no, let Brian, let Brian, you go with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to throw in jargon. I hate that when people do that to me. So posterior chain is really talking about the musculature in the back of the leg and all the way up to the lower torso, like we were talking before. So it includes your calves, your hamstrings, your glute muscles, and your lower back as well, because they're all linked together in certain manners, and they're all tend to be neglected because of the the amount of sitting that we do. And then obviously if you're sitting as part of your sport, like you are in triathlon, then that's another issue that you definitely need to deal with.
Oh,
I,
great.
I would say it's the muscles you can't see.
That's right. Not the mirror muscles.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. All right. Thank you, Bob, for that. And then Bob also asked, do you have a recommended sleep app or sleep device?
Oh yeah, that's not my realm. I mean, I do a lot of work with Air Force Research Labs, and that's really their bailiwick, because they're really into which device does what. I know a lot of people really like the Aura Ring. I don't have any personal experience with that, but I've seen some data where it's pretty powerful. For me, I use the Garmin Sleep app. I mean, I look at my data. This is a Phoenix Phoenix 6, and it's not useless. I'm not like putting a whole lot of stock into how much is going on in my like how much time I spent in REM,
Yeah.
but for the most part, it's not bad as far as like my overall, like if I wake up in the morning, like I don't feel like I slept good last night. I look at it, I'm like, oh yeah, you were pretty active. It makes sense. But I'm also at the point where I can pretty much tell, like, yeah, I didn't sleep last night. So you don't want to get like, you don't want to become a slave to the technology. But and there are other ones out there, but then there's not just the monitoring technology, but the sleep augmented technology, like controlling the temperature in the room, right? Can I pump air into my bed? My wife and I joke, like, how did we stay married before we had a king size bed? Neither of us are big people, but we like our space, right? So it's like, how do we stay married when we were in a queen bed, like, practically on top of each other? So the technology to control the environment is actually pretty fascinating as well. Getting the light out of the room is huge. When I moved to Las Vegas, I bought this house and it has these giant east-south facing windows. And at 4:30 in the morning, I'm like, well, I guess I'm up, because now the sun's up and now everybody's up. So you figure out a way to darken that room in a hurry.
I love it.
And then, and you mentioned too, like your environment is so critical. I mean, there's a whole world of sleep hygiene. I actually teach a class in sleep hygiene in our program, and it blows the students' minds, like all these little things that you can do. And it's not rocket science. So if anyone once again wants to look at that, just Google in sleep hygiene, and there's a lot of good tricks that you can use, and not even tricks, just things you can do.
My favorite saying around sleep hygiene is that the bed is for two things, and one of them is sleeping.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then I will speak to the Aura Ring. So I do use the Aura Ring, and I did use a Whoop strap for a long time. And then I actually wore them both for a while, and I found when we're looking at just pure, like when you're asleep and when you're awake, for me, the Aura Ring was better, and that was the most important, because like the deep sleep, REM sleep, I was getting deep sleep in the first half and I was getting REM sleep in the second half. And did it make a difference if I got 50 minutes of REM sleep or 100 minutes of REM sleep? It didn't make me feel any different, but just like the pure hours to me was the most important thing. So
I mean, I think you guys start with the simplest variable. I think for some people, it's just a question of the form factor. I really didn't like the idea of wearing a watch at night, but now I'm used to it. So now it doesn't bother me anymore. But the technology matters. So for instance, I had a Garmin Forerunner, and I literally switched over like in one day, and my resting heart rate went down. Like, did it really? Or was it really just that now my Phoenix is better at measuring my resting heart rate than my Forerunner was, or vice versa? Maybe the Forerunner, but I don't think it was, because I think it was more variable. So the technology matters. So when you change technologies, you have to understand that your variables might be different because you're changing the technology, or because one of them is more or less accurate.
Okay, I want to switch back to strength, since that's your area.
Yeah.
So what would be, I guess, your sales pitch on why a triathlete should incorporate strength training? If just someone randomly asked you that question, because that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an injury professional. You're the athletic trainer, but I would say is you can't perform when you're hurt. And so people want to separate the performance world versus the injury prevention world. It's like, no, you can't perform if you're hurt. So injury prevention is extremely important for performance. It's not just for injury prevention. You have to be able to compete or to train to perform. And so I would say that the main thing is to make sure that you have the injury prevention. And on that same note, it's the longevity. As I'm older, and especially with the populations that I work with, Like a lot of the Green Berets I work with are a lot older than you'd think they are. And they're starting to realize that, yeah, I want to stay active, or now that I've achieved this level of tactical age, now it's a matter of, can I hold off father time for a while? And that's, I think, incorporating strength training can be one of the best ways to hold off father time.
So I'll add something from the athletic training point. So in general, when somebody comes to me with an injury, like an endurance sport injury, there's a few things I look at. So number one, I look at, it probably was a training error. They probably did too much training. Number two, we look at some of the very basic, biomechanical errors they could make. And then number three, we look at strength. And out of most of those things, the thing that seems to be most effective at least turning them around is the strength side. And so giving them specific strength exercises. So I was listening to this was a podcast a while ago, and it was a professional triathlete who, she finally figured it out. She's like, you know what? Every time I get injured, I go to a therapist or an athletic trainer, and they give me these exercises to do. So why don't I just do them all the time? And since she started doing that, she wasn't getting hurt anymore. And so if you think about it, if you're in this perpetual cycle of injury recovery or injury rehab, look at this as, look at your strength training as, we use the term prehab, right? Prehabilitation. So you're not injured, you're preventing injury. The tough thing to sell is like, and I tell my students this all the time too, is like, nobody wants to do injury prevention until they're injured, right? So we've always kind of sold it as performance, but I think with this crowd of triathletes that we have, I think that this is probably will hit home a little bit with the message we've given them tonight.
I think the other thing to add into that is that it's another form of cross training.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of training variety, which can be good especially for the old timer, right? Or the people who spend a lot of time in the seat and on the road. Like, okay, here's a way for me to train. And so I'm doing something and I'm actually helping my sport, but I'm also not doing just more of the other stuff. And so I'm getting some training variety, and it's good for my brain, good for my outlook on life. And if you incorporate it correctly in the off season, there's nothing wrong with it.
And the one last thing I'm going to throw in here is, let's say you've got a 3-hour bike ride on the schedule. There's not much difference in a 3-hour bike ride and a 2.5-hour bike ride. But if you did 2.5 hours and then you did a half hour of strength training, I think there's a significant difference. So we all say we're time crunched, but I think we're time crunched by choice sometimes. And I think being maybe a little bit smarter about, when we do what we're doing, what we're really trying to get out of our training, I think could be somewhat helpful in people in their scheduling.
Agreed.
Yeah, well, you two have almost convinced me I need to do more strength training. But I also, and this, Brian, I liked how you talked about just doing mobility exercises. I mean, I incorporate a lot of sort of natural movements. Like I always try to take the stairs if I can do that. I like the downhill type of work on the muscles, things like that are just easy to incorporate.
Yeah, I mean, you can combine a lot of things together. Like you can do your barefoot work on the grass,
Yeah,
so you can get some barefoot work in, and you can also get some grounding in and spend some time in nature and do those types of things. You can kind of squeeze some things together and get the benefits of them at the same time.
We covered a lot of ground tonight. This is awesome.
Yeah, we did.
Nobody ever accused me of not wanting to talk, so
That's why you're a good professor, right? Like just get in front and just go. I like it. No, but seriously, Brian, this was great. I learned some good little tidbits tonight, and we almost convinced John to start strength training. So we're getting somewhere. And for those of you that were listening live, thank you so much, and thanks for the questions. It was once again a good Friday night. I think I feel better at 7 o'clock than I did at 6 o'clock, and I attribute that to the evidence-based triathlete.
awesome.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Brian. Really appreciate it.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, have a good night.